Great to see all of you this morning. Excited for our message this morning on wine drinking in the Bible. I know it's this time of year, it's a relevant thing. Your inbox or your news feed is probably getting messages about how to recover from the hangover, what top 10 foods are best for the hangover. Did you know that your Cincinnati's chili actually made the list this year? So I know you're proud. You're proud of that. I know some of you, I don't know, maybe you who moved here recently maybe think, oh, good, a use for that now. Sorry, I don't mean any offense. Of course, when you read an article that is, how to avoid the hangover home remedies, you're probably thinking, well, I know something that would work, right? It's like those lists on, well, how to avoid, unwanted pregnancies or STDs. We're first in line to suggest, perhaps abstinence is the best course. And just as I'm thinking that, I get to the end of one article and it says, or you could consider not drinking. But then the author pokes fun at his own facetious suggestion and says, yeah, right. But I want to suggest to you that perhaps he's onto something there by not drinking. You know, even the world recognizes that drunkenness is bad. And it's interesting that the world's in on so many different subjects wants to suggest that there are safe and responsible ways of committing sin. Concerning drinking, it is drink responsibly. Concerning gambling, it is, they feign concern for us by saying if you have a gambling problem, suggesting that gambling itself is not the problem. Or with sex, it's practice safe sex. That's just a tool and device of the world. And, the world has its own definition of safe this and responsible that. But, we're concerned more about what the scriptures teach is safe, responsible, and wise. Do the scriptures teach that an occasional and moderate usage of alcohol is acceptable to God so long as we don't get drunk, as many people say? We'll start out in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 24, to establish the fact that God is not, as some have referred to, a cosmic killjoy. He's not someone that just is all about taking all the fun out of life. It says in Ecclesiastes 2:24, there's nothing better for a man than that he should eat and drink and enjoy good in his labor. So, some might read that and think, well, I can't really enjoy myself unless I'm drinking alcohol. And those who abstain from alcohol may be quick to interject, but here it doesn't say drink wine. So we understand that the scriptures say God wants us to find joy in eating and drinking. The simple pleasures of life are something that he has created for us to enjoy. So again, flip over to chapter 9, verse 8. He says, in verse 7, go eat your bread with joy and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already accepted your works. Let your garments always be white and let your head lack no oil. In 1 Timothy 6:17, it talks about the things that God has richly supplied for us to enjoy. Eating and drinking, he says, is something that we should enjoy. But what about the enjoyment of intoxicating drink? Is that something which he has recommended to us or given to us as a gift? And in order to answer that question, I want to make a few points with you this morning that I found were enlightening in making my own decision about alcohol. The first of which, of course, that we need to lay the foundation, which much of the world already accepts, and that is that drunkenness is wrong. For one reason or another, even the world recognizes this. But in the Old Testament, it was actually potentially a death penalty offense. In Deuteronomy chapter 21, 20 through 21, it's that well-known passage that says that if a man had a son who was rebellious and would not obey their voice, And that if he was a glutton and a drunkard, then the men of his city shall stone him to death with stones, so you shall put away the evil from among you. So drunkenness is a sin, and it was a sin that would potentially be a sin against one's own life. It's also a sin against one's soul. As we read from 1 Thessalonians 5, 1 through 8, drunkenness was described as one who was a child of darkness, one who was ill-prepared for the coming of the Lord, who would be caught unsuspecting of his return, but that those who were watching and waiting for his return would be referred to as children of light and not surprised by his coming. And it recommends and encourages us to be sober and watchful and not to be asleep. And there's a connection between spiritual slumber and insobriety in this text. And so, in a related way, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 10, in making the case that drunkenness is a sin against the soul, argues that we should not be deceived that drunkards, among many other sinners, will not inherit the kingdom of God. In the previous chapter, in chapter 5, verse 11 of 1 Corinthians, he says, "But now I have written to you not to keep company with anyone named a brother who is sexually immoral or covetous or an idolater, a reviler or a drunkard or an extortioner, not even to eat with such a person." So we are supposed to be sober. And Ephesians 5:18 says that we should not be filled or drunk with wine, but instead filled with the Spirit. So instead of being intoxicated by and influenced by alcohol, we're supposed to be influenced by the Spirit who is in us. And then thirdly, it's spoken of scripturally, we can see from the results of drinking alcohol that it can be a sin against one's own body, one's own existence, his life. It can be something that is a scourge upon one's existence, be it his future, his family, or his freedom. There's a great quote from a president of the Ozark Bible College that I'm borrowing for this subject. He says, "For a minute, forget about making a definitive case for or against drinking from the Bible. Here's the truth from logic and real life. No one starts out to be an alcoholic. Everyone begins with a defensive attitude saying, 'I'm just a social drinker and there's nothing wrong with it.' No one says, 'It is my ambition that someday I want to lose my job, my health and self-respect, my marriage, my family. That someday I want to be dependent on alcohol to get through my day.' Yet this is the destination at which several millions of people have arrived. Why do you suppose that is? It is because alcohol is promoted and elevated as normal and sophisticated activity in life. It is also expensive, addictive, enslaving. People get hooked by America's #1 legal drug, and just like all illegal drugs, alcohol finds its way into the body, the bloodstream, and the brain of the user-abuser." So that makes a good point there, especially concerning the one who says, I didn't set out to do this. I set out to just enjoy myself. And yet millions have found themselves struggling with drunkenness and the tendency towards addiction. So to the one who says, "I'm just a social drinker," I want to recommend to you the thinking of 1 Corinthians chapter 10 in verse 12, where it says, "Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall." There's wisdom in that. This originally was the argument used against going to an idol's temple and participating, or maybe one who said, I'm not gonna partake, but I'm gonna go to the temple, or some sort of connection to the idol's temple, or eating of meat that had been sacrificed to idol. The argument here is you think that you're going to be strong enough to withstand this ultimate connection to idolatry, but you might not be as strong as you think. So he's warding people away from that in the first century because of where it could lead and the potential pitfalls involved in it. I think that's a pretty good connection to what we're talking about. Let him who thinks he stands, let him who thinks he's strong enough to be that social drinker, and that it's not going to lead to drunkenness. That's a dangerous gamble. And Jesus taught in Matthew 7 that we can measure the worth of a thing or evaluate its merits based upon the fruit that it produces. He says that a tree, if it is good, will produce good fruit. He used that in connection with false teachers. You can look at the fruit of the false teacher. He used that in reference to the tongue and the things that a person says. And so by principle, we apply it to this subject as well. Look at the fruit of drinking and the consequences that people have had to bear. So it's a sin against oneself as well. Well, so I asked the question, is there a responsible use for wine in the Scriptures? Is there a way that it was ever recommended or commended to men? And that may be somewhat of a curveball, because you're probably familiar with passages that talk about Timothy taking a little bit of wine for his stomach's sake in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 23. And so, as tempting as it might be for us today to, like we've talked about in times past recently, draw a hedge around it and say that the only way for membership would be total abstinence, would be a dangerous thing, because that wasn't necessarily the scriptural approach to answering the question. Because Paul didn't recommend total abstinence, but don't take that too far. We need to understand and practice discernment with this question, lest we find ourselves having gone too far. And there's some reasons why he didn't recommend total abstinence that we're going to talk about in just a minute. But there's two shortcomings primarily by people who I believe have come to a wrong conclusion about alcohol, and that is not understanding the difference between the cultures and their use of wine, as well as the language and what is meant by wine. Because, and it might sound like a cop-out for a preacher to say, wine didn't mean what it meant today, what it meant back then. And you probably should be suspicious in some cases of someone saying, that word doesn't mean what you think it means. Here, let me redefine the word for you. But let me just give you a scriptural example. A scriptural example of this, before we get too much into that, so that you're not distracted. Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 7. Ecclesiastes 9, verse 7, I already read for you, where it says, go and eat your bread in happiness and drink your wine with a cheerful heart, for God has approved your works. So a person who said, well, the Bible's position on wine is that we should just enjoy ourselves with it. But be careful, However, Proverbs chapter 20, verse 1 says, wine is a mocker, strong drink a brawler, and whoever is led astray by it is not wise. In one case, it says it seems to commend bread and wine for enjoyment, and here it speaks of it as a mocker and something that would entice only those who are unwise. In chapter 23, verses 29 through 30, who has woe, who has sorrow and contentions and complaints and wounds without cause? Who has redness of eyes? Those who linger long at the wine, those who go in search of mixed wine. Do not look on the wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup, when it swirls around smoothly. At the last it bites like a serpent and stings like a viper. Your eyes will see strange things, and your heart will utter perverse things. Yes, you will be like one who lies down in the midst of the sea, or like one who lies at the top of the mast, saying, they have struck me, but I was not hurt. They have beaten me, but I did not feel it. When shall I awake that I may seek another drink? So that obviously that concludes with a reference to the slavery that it produces in so many people's life, that he wakes up and he's looking for another drink. That's become his pursuit in life. So one text says go have some bread and wine. The other says, don't even look at it. Don't look at it when it's swirling in the cup. Be aware, it's dangerous. It's going to sting you like a viper. How do you reconcile those two? And I want to again suggest to you that wine is not necessarily, should not be read and just the concept of wine in those days with what we have today just conveyed into the modern day as though we're talking about the same thing. And it would be a non-issue here if the Holy Spirit had spoken with specific words that in the New Testament always reference one kind of wine versus another, be it the fresh juice, fruit of the grape versus intoxicating wine. But he didn't do that. You know, we've got the word oinos and others like it that are used in reference to both kinds of wine. However, in the Old Testament, I think we do find some convincing arguments that prove the point that I'm trying to make here. Okay, there's this word tarosh, and I'm not even going to venture to pronounce Hebrew. I don't know Hebrew, and I can read transliterated English from Hebrew words, and I can reference strong numbers and make sure that I'm talking about the same word. So when I look at these words, for example, tarosh, or yayin, or shakar, I learned something very enlightening. So the word tarosh is a word that is spoken of in reference to spiritual blessings, physical blessings, peace, comfort, joy, and gladness. For example, in Proverbs 3 verse 10, he says, "Your vats will overflow with new wine." And that in reference to the blessings of God upon men. It's defined by Strong's as the must or fresh grape juice, as just squeezed out, by implication, rarely fermented wine. You've got yayin is another example. Excuse me, I didn't have that. I guess I forgot to mention yayin on my notes here. Y-A-Y-I-N, as it's transliterated. It is used reference to intoxicating and non-intoxicating. In Genesis 9:21, too much yayin led to the shame of Noah being found naked in his tent by his sons. It was too much yayin that led to commit the abominable acts that were committed by the daughters of Lot. And so yayin obviously had the potential of intoxication, but in the same vein, yayin also is referenced in Isaiah 16 verse 10, where it says that the time would come from Moab when those who tread yayin at the presses would cease. You don't tread fermented wine. That's not how it works. That's a fresh juice process. Jeremiah recounts in Lamentations 2:12 that children would be heard crying in Judah for bread and yayin. So you look at the context and you understand that children are not looking for fermented wine whereby they might become drunk. So it's ambiguous there. You can't tell anything necessarily one way or another with yayin. However, with the word shakar, the Hebrew word only translated in wine in one place, in Numbers 28 verse 7, and there it is strong wine. In every other place where the Hebrew word shakar, as we would say it, is used, it is used and translated as strong drink. And to my understanding, without exception, shakar is a reference to that which produces violence or misery or woe or shame, apostasy, and divine wrath. And so it's pretty easy to tell when you're looking at the word shakar that that's something that would be something we should not look at as it swirls in the cup. That is like a viper that will sting you and should be avoided. But here's the kicker, and that is that due to modern distillation practices, the alcoholic content in our wines today would be equivalent to what was referred to as shakar in the Old Testament. And that's compelling. The wines of Jesus' day had the alcoholic content of 6 to 8%. Strong drink had the alcoholic content of 14%. And our wines today are just 2%. They start at 2% less than Shakar at 12%. And they go up from there. And so if in the Old Testament God condemned and warned against and spoke negatively of this strong drink without exception, then how can we come to the New Testament and find a word like oinos and think that wine is wine and we're going to drink our wine and eat our bread and just enjoy life with any level or degree of confidence? I want to read for you something discovered or written by Richard Stein in his work. This is from 1982. He wrote the findings of his research on wine drinking in the ancient world from Jewish sources and from the Bible. He pointed out that wine in Homer's day was mixed 20 parts water and 1 part wine. This is from Odyssey, and then he gives the reference. Pliny referred to wine as 8 parts water and 1 part wine. According to Aristophanes, it was stronger, 3 parts water to 2 parts wine. Other classical Greek writers spoke of other mixtures like Eunos, 3 parts water to 1 part wine, Hesiod, Alexis, 4 to 1, Diocles and Anacreon, 2 to 1, and others. The average ratio of the mixture among the Greeks was 3 or 4 parts water to wine. And anyone who drank wine unmixed was looked on as a Scythian or a barbarian. And he writes in conclusion, that means the Greeks would say to us today, you Americans are barbarians drinking straight wine. Another quote has, for example, Athenaeus quoted Nisitheus of Athens as saying, in daily intercourse to those who drink it moderately, it gives good cheer. But if you overstep the bounds, it brings violence. Mix it half and half, and you get madness. Unmixed, bodily collapse. Here's a pagan saying that half and half is madness, and unmixed brings death. And to me, you learn that about them, and you know that's substantiated. I've got this National Geographic article printout. It's all black and white. I don't think it'd come out very good on overhead, but anybody who's really interested in this sort of thing, this was printed in the National Geographic. Discoveries of shipwrecked articles that were discovered, various kinds of pottery that they found, where they named these things, the two-handled amphora, this other thing called a crater. He describes the practice of the Greeks and says they always mixed it with water, and they brought water from the well or fountain house in a round jar called a hydria, with 2 horizontal handles for lifting and 1 vertical handle for pouring. They mixed the wine and water in a large bowl, a crater, much like a modern punch bowl. From the crater, the diluted wine was dipped with a ladle, usually of metal, and decanted into a pitcher. Lastly, the wine was poured from the pitcher into 1 or 2 handled drinking cups. So when you've got even the National Geographic saying Greeks, they just didn't drink it straight. This is how they did. This isn't about preachers trying to make some compelling argument against alcohol or building a hedge. When you've got Greeks telling you you're crazy to drink it unmixed, and then we try to say, well, it says wine in the Bible. Well, that's just dishonest. We can't compare apples and oranges any more than we can compare apples and grapes with one another. They're just not the same thing. Well, and the conversation about whether or not Jesus created fermented wine, to me, doesn't even matter here anymore. When you look at these different, even if he did, you've got a master of the feast present there whose job it was to make sure that this mixture took place. And he would have overseen that kind of racial ratio was practiced. And it makes sense why they would mix their wine in order to purify their water. They didn't have Brita back then. They don't have reverse osmosis. They had alcohol, which kills bacteria, and mixed together would kill the impurities, and they could drink. Timothy comes across as one who likely wanted to be completely pure from it, maybe thinking, maybe he read his Old Testament and saw what it said about the Nazirite vow. He's like, I'll give that a try, and he gets sick. I don't know how that came about, but he seems to have been drinking water exclusively, and it's not working out in that day and time. And so it is recommended that he have a little wine for his stomach's sake, because it'll help with those impurities. But I want you to notice all of the things that aren't said when those who use 1 Timothy 5:23 to justify social drinking that they're not paying attention to. So when Paul says no longer drink only water, but use a little wine for your stomach's sake and your frequent infirmities, it says, in effect, don't drink the water, which was to be the source of his trouble. Notice that it says, use wine. Use it. It is a tool. It is a device. It's not imbibe in wine or drink. Let it flow freely, but use it to suggest that it is a tool or a device for his health. It says a little. Take a little wine. Those who find social drinking authority from 1 Timothy 5:23 are also, I think, kind of glossing over the quantity which was recommended, which would be a little wine, which to me sounds a lot more like 3-to-1 than it does drinking a glass of wine at a restaurant. And so not very good argumentation for us to use as well. Other points to consider as we bring this to a close. From Romans chapter 14, verse 21, there's also other considerations, even if we're not looking at wine and what is it. Other things that I think would impact our decision making if we're trying to discern the merits of drinking today. Romans 14, verse 21. It is good neither to eat meat, nor drink wine, nor do anything by which your brother stumbles or is offended or is made weak. Again, don't read that and think, well, don't picture sitting in a restaurant with a glass of what would be referred to as strong drink. Because Paul, if you had said, Paul, are you talking about drinking, liquor here? Are you talking about drinking hard alcohol? He said, that's not at all what I'm talking about. He's not saying, I would give up my hard alcohol if I would do it for my brother's sake. It's not what he's referencing. We already know what even the ancients, what even non-believers would have perceived about drinking that kind of stuff back then. If that was under consideration, he would have said something like he did in chapter 5. It's reported that even among the Gentiles you're doing this, and they can't even believe that it's the case. No, instead he's talking about using it kind of like he recommended to Timothy here. I wouldn't even use a little bit, and I don't think we are making a very good presentation of ourselves as being credible when we just try to rewrite words as meaning whatever suits our purpose here. Because if he's talking about grape juice here, freshly squeezed from the grape, where is the effect of this verse? But it makes a lot more sense that if somebody's going to be offended even by my use of fermented wine that is completely diluted and mixed with water, I'll forego that. I might even get a little stomach ache for the benefit of my brother who might not be made to stumble. So there's the stumbling block question or issue. There's also, as we referenced before, the issue of our strength and whether or not we're going to be able to withstand the temptations. I read one writer talk about the fact that a former alcoholic was in communion at a church that served this 12% wine alcoholic content, And it was enough to send this guy back into the throes of alcoholism, because just the taste of it on his tongue proved to be, in his experience, too much to handle. I know anecdotal evidence like that, but they say that can happen, and abstinence is the only safe approach for someone who's had that experience. What about the appearance argument and the consideration? 1 Thessalonians 5:22 warns about the appearance of evil. You can ask someone on the street, as happened to my wife one time when she worked in Arkansas. She worked with a friend from Tyson Foods who would always try to get her to go out and have a drink. And finally she just said to her friend, "What would you think if me as I don't know if a Christian or a preacher's wife went out to do that with you?" She said, "Well, I would think that you were kind of a hypocrite," but she wanted her to go anyway, so she kept asking. Before this conversation, she admitted that she would have thought that was a little bit out of place for a preacher's wife to go to have a drink. Maybe not everyone feels like that, but how many people do? How many would be surprised or give it a second thought as they see it in our carts, or the checkout person seeing us check out at the store with it? And if you're having to ask someone to supply it for you, are you really confident that this is a good practice? According to Romans 14, verse 23, whatever is not from faith is sin, and whoever doubts is condemned if he eats or drinks, I might add, because he does not eat from faith, for whatever is not from faith is sin. After hearing all of that, can you really say that I am convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that it is just fine for me to go out and drink strong drink? And if so, I worry for you. It is not something that will have no effect whatsoever on our ministry. As 2 Corinthians chapter 5 says, that Paul sought to, or chapter 6, verse 4, or verse 3, we give no offense in anything, that our ministry may not be blamed. He was all about, what can I give up? What can I sacrifice? What can I do for the sake of the gospel? What can I give up? I become all things to all men. And when even some men think that you would be a total hypocrite for being a Christian, drinking straight wine or beer or liquor or whatever the case was, strong drink, then do we really want to open ourselves up to that condemnation? So I want to close with one more passage. Close that out from 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 3, which I think if you were looking for verses, well, where does it say to not to? 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 3 talks, in my understanding, of 3 stages of drinking. The excesses of drunkenness, the revelings, carousings, and then the banquetings and drinking parties. Again, 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 3. For we have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles, when we walked in lewdness and lusts and drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. So obviously drunkenness refers to just being completely plastered, and we've seen that. We've seen that depicted on TV. We've seen it in person. We've seen it at the ballpark. People just have no control of themselves. You can't walk. Your speech is slurred. Okay, we understand revelings and carousals. He feels the alcohol, but he's still functioning. He's having a good time, but he's obviously loosened up quite a bit, which is why this is so dangerous. It's not sober. It's not watchful. It is a removal of one's inhibitions to act as he would not act. And then banqueting and drinking parties is defined as a drinking not necessarily excessive by one Greek lexicon. Not necessarily excessive. We're talking about 3 stages of drinking, and Peter's trying to tell us that's the way of the Gentiles, And there was a time for that perhaps in our past, but we should recognize that we've wasted enough time living like that in fulfilling the will of the Gentiles. And so I leave you with Abraham Lincoln's words, drinking has many defenders, but no defense. And again, I'm not trying to say there's only one answer here and it's absolute abstinence. Here we take NyQuil with alcohol in it, right? We have so many options available to us that weren't available to them, and they aid us in that way. They help us when we're sick. But let's make sure that we're comparing apples with apples and not apples and oranges together, and that we're wise and that we practice good discernment with such things. It's okay if in the end I find out I was wrong about alcohol. I could have been drinking all this wine. How about at the day of judgment? You want to be wrong about that, or do you want to say, boy, I could have drunk more? Is there anybody that will spend the first 1,000,000 years in heaven lamenting the fact that he could have drunk more wine if only he hadn't gone to church that day and heard that sermon? So I appreciate your kind attention. If you have questions or comments about that, I welcome your kind approach to me and want to welcome that opportunity to you. Otherwise, this is what helps me and helped me make my decision. And I'm thankful that I got this knowledge early in life before it turned my life upside down and I lived the tale that we told early on. So again, appreciate your attention and want to appeal to those in the congregation who may find themselves ill-prepared to stand before God. We've already studied that there are sins in our lives that can cost us our souls. We need not be deceived about such things. We should not accept the frailty of our humanity as a defense for the way we are, because Christ died and offers us his grace that it might teach us to deny that ungodliness and live for Jesus. If you're ready to live for Jesus and turn from your sins and be buried, to have your sins washed from you, to raise a new creature and a new creation, we invite you to come forward now while we stand and sing.